Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this bluetongue virus webinar. I'm Mandy Neville from AHDB, and it's a very warm welcome to you this evening. Now, the next slide, please. To begin with, I'll just do a few housekeeping slides before I hand over to our chairs, Gareth and Fiona. So we are facilitating this webinar on behalf of BTV Sheep Veterinary Society and the British Veterinary Camelid Society. It's intended to allow vets to have a confidential discussion about products that are not yet fully authorised, and for that reason we would like it to be a vet-only webinar. So could I ask that if you are not a vet, that you just politely leave the webinar now. The webinar will be recorded. We're not going to put it in open access because we will be discussing unauthorised products, but we will be putting out a link if you are a vet that you'll require that link to join the webinar. You'll hear from our speakers and there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. So please do put your questions in the chat box throughout. There is a tab for doing that. Please do feel free to ask any questions that you can. And at the end, please complete the feedback form with any additional topics or questions that you may have. Next slide, please. Just want to alert you to the resource page on the Ruminant Health and Welfare website. There's a huge amount of information there. There's a lot of information on the AHDB website and also on the government website, so please do look at those for further information. And on the next slide, you'll see that there is a survey that's just about to close, totally anonymous, but we are encouraging farmers who have had bluetongue in particular to fill in that form. That survey will help us inform decisions next year when no doubt we will see bluetongue re-emerge. So without further ado, I will hand over to Gareth, who is going to chair the first part of the webinar, and I wish you a successful webinar. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Mandy. Yeah, to introduce myself, I'm Gareth Haitley. I'm the current BVA Scottish Branch President. I'm a retired vet specialising in disease surveillance. I'm sit on the core group, the bluetongue core group. I'm also on the board of BCVA. So I'll introduce people as we go. But first, I thought I'll just give you a very brief introduction to the vaccine principles that we're talking about. So a lot more will become apparent as we go through. Once I've done that, we'll go into sort of a section on economic impact, and then on the disease impact, and then we'll finish with a vaccination risk assessment, which I think is the key part of the whole thing this evening. And then the aim is to have a good long Q&A session that will enable you to ask hopefully the questions that you that are burning. So briefly, the vaccine we're talking about is against bluetongue 3. Bear in mind that we're dealing with something like 25 different serotypes with bluetongue. There's no cross immunity between the different serotypes. The vaccines that are available for use in the EU and in Britain are killed vaccines. They're not live, and that immediately gives us a limit of perhaps a maximum of 2 strains per vaccine. But in this situation, we're dealing with BTV3 specifically. These vaccines have been developed very, very quickly by a number of manufacturers. They've been developed using the same platforms, and by that I mean things like the excipients, the adjuvants, the manufacturing process, as BTV8. And so that has enabled the manufacturers to advance a lot of information to enable vaccine production. But we're dealing with a different serotype, and antigenically these behave differently. And so the first thing to say is that currently the vaccines that are available for BTV3 have been released on emergency authorization by a number of countries. At the moment, the information provided by the manufacturers is necessarily limited and incomplete, and that's the reason why we can't have any full or partial marketing authorizations at the moment. It also means that because the information that's available in the provided by the dossiers by each manufacturer, we are limited in what we can use the vaccines for. So at the moment, they can't be used for example, changing zones, enabling trade, which are the things that we can do with BTV8. That's a big difference between the two. The vaccines are available for use through a general license, which is available on gov.uk. And at the moment, this is available for England only. The use of vaccine is not allowed in Wales, Scotland, or Northern Ireland. I'll stop at that point there. The only other thing I would say is that this is very much a changing situation. The manufacturers are improving the evidence base almost as we speak. So it's going to be a changing situation as we go into the vector low period, which we're not in just yet. So I think the take home from that is keep yourself informed and be aware of the changing situation. So I'll stop there on vaccine, and I'll move to Fiona Lovett, who will be well known to you, and she's going to start with a session on the economic impact of bluetongue. So over to you, Fiona.
Thanks, Gareth. So from the start of it, these are AHDB have put these figures together. We've collected data through the impact survey, and some of that data that we've contributed to setting up this, but it's a model of the economic impact of bluetongue 3 in sheep in the UK. So next slide, please. So just quickly, I'll go through the methodology. The methodology. As you know, models it's difficult to model things, and you just have to go with best estimates. These figures can be updated or improved when we get more information. So they've used a sheep value of £131 per sheep based on latest dead weight prices and average carcass weights. Losses from mortality assume total loss for the output price of the sheep. Fertility losses there's in each of the different scenarios, a proportion of infected sheep were assumed not to give birth to a live lamb the following year, and similar value for the value of the sheep is used. Reduced productivity based on the cost to treat and finish, to treat animals that are significantly ill, and that was based on 10% of the final value. And then the restriction costs, this was in the impact survey. By and large, we've had about 250 responses. The vast majority of those are people who don't actually have bluetongue but have been affected by the restriction. So there is a real cost to there being a restriction zone in place, and the industry has to recognise that. And these economic figures have tried to put a value on that, and they've put it as 5% for every non-infected sheep within that zone. As I say, as we get more information, we can refine these figures. The reason the AHDB levy rate is in there, because to justify doing this work, it makes a big difference to AHDB if there's not a levy coming in because of the effect, which has justified it to the board. Next slide, please. So if we look at the lowest, the best case scenario, and if you think about back in August, a few cases of BTV3 in the UK, we assume that those 3 counties were affected, and that was 2% of the total sheep and lambs in England. If 5% of those flocks within the zone had 5% of their sheep infected, then you can calculate it up, and you can see you can add up losses from mortality, losses from reduced productivity, fertility losses, and there, quite obviously, the biggest costs are the costs of the restrictions to those farmers in the zone, 1.5 million, and that would probably reflect early on in our survey where we were best case in 2024. Next slide, please. Scenario B is as bluetongue spreads across, and so a few more infected counties, and for example, if more of the flocks within the zone are infected and more of the sheep within those flocks are infected. This is only sheep cost here because sheep are most severely clinically infected, and there will be vets who have farmers who, cattle, there are not many clinical signs in cattle. You can often be subclinically affected. It's sheep where the biggest impact is from losses from mortality and cases. So that's a sort of pretty much summarises what we think the cost would be for the UK in 2024. So we're basically at about 234,000 in terms of mortality. By far, still the biggest costs are the 3 million in the cost restrictions. Next slide, please. Worst case, or not worst case, but the worst case for this year, you can see that as a restriction zone has spread across, affecting potentially 4.2 million sheep. And we think now we're pretty much coming out of the bluetongue season, so we don't think it has been this bad. The reason for the impact survey is because we didn't know how bad it has been until we've been gathering impact data from people. But say 25% of the flocks in the zone were affected and 30% of the sheep within each flock was infected. Those are not unrealistic figures if you consider what's happened in the Netherlands over the last 2 years and also in Germany currently. That's quite realistic for the European situation. You can see we're up to mortality losses at 26 million, also reduction in productivity, fertility, and more restriction losses because we've got more restrictions. It's a bigger area. Final scenario is actually looking at the worst case that could happen next year in 2025. So next slide, please. In 2025, if we assume that bluetongue is as bad in England as it has been in the Netherlands and Germany this year, it could be, worst case, up to say 50% of flocks affected and potentially up to 50% of the sheep within those flocks affected. Then obviously the losses from mortality, reduced productivity and fertility are incredibly high. Straight away, we go to zero cost from restriction because everybody is in the same zone. And so there are still the consequences for other devolved areas and movement in and out, but we're just in this situation looking at England. And although this is obviously really bad, it's not ridiculous compared to some of the figures that have been coming out of Europe. And I haven't, these are models. Hopefully we can improve this and put more nuances in there, but it is just worth pointing out to people how bad things could be. Nobody wants to scaremonger, but we do need to be realistic that there's potential for it to be very bad. Just the next slide, please. This is looking at the density of livestock in the UK. These are DEFRA maps, and I'm sorry, they're a bit small, but you can see the cases of BTV3 reported in the UK down in those southeast areas, and you can see the restriction zone as from not the recent expansion, but until recently. The density, the sheep on the left in the green, cattle on the right in the blue, you can see that we've had BTV3 in the really minimal livestock areas, And this is a justification for the restrictions being in place. And we know from the impact that the impact survey tells us, as people have said, how crippling economically being in a restriction zone has been, how people haven't been able to sell animals, have been really affected. You can see how those restrictions were put in place to protect more livestock dense parts of the UK, and arguably there's been good reasons for that. So that's just to explain, there will be the situation, if we get spread, heaven forbid, but we have to be prepared. If we do get spread, and the restriction zone is then no longer restricted, it's everybody's in the same boat, they will remove restriction zones. That's not a case of flip-flopping policy. There's a very good reason. Once we're all in the same boat and we've got disease out there loose in the midges, there are no restriction zones, so no costs from that. But golly, the costs from mortality, reduced fertility, and productivity impacts in flocks will be huge. Not nice slides to present, and and they are models, but worth everybody considering, I think. I'm now going to hand back to you, Gareth. I think it's Joe speaking.
Great.
Yeah, thanks. Just to introduce Joe, who's past president of the Sheep Veterinary Society and in practice in Northumberland. So over to you, Joe.
Thanks very much, Gareth, and yeah, pretty sobering slides there, Fiona. If you could just go to the next slide, please, Anna. Great. So first thing really that we don't know is how bad it will be next year. We've not had a massive amount of responses this year. There's not been a huge number of cases, but what we do think is that there's actually been very limited onward spread. If only 1 or 2 sheep in a flock of 200-300 become ill, that's sort of demonstrating there's not onward spread, it's not infected midges from that sheep spreading further, because it's just a pretty low rate of getting ill. The other thing we do know is that those that actually become ill show clinical signs. A huge number of them do end up going on to die, and that's pretty savage sort of numbers there, and that fits also with what's happening in Europe before they had the vaccine. There are quite a lot of the sheep in this country have been picked up almost on surveillance and haven't had clinical signs, and they haven't had obviously that death rate. But those that show the signs, a lot of them, despite treatment, end up dying. And then the vaccines that Gareth's going to talked a little bit about there, they're not they're more suppressive vaccines rather than preventative vaccines. So you do still get some illness, but the mortality rate reduces from the 70% to 10% after they've been vaccinated. So that's pretty comforting in some ways. Thank you, changing the slide there. So as Fiona's alluded to there, next year it could get a fair bit worse. The reason is that this virus, African virus, it needs at least 12 degrees to multiply in the midges, but actually it's much happier in the warmer sort of 25-degree type things. And we've been pretty lucky that this year it came in, I think 11th of August or what have you, by which time it's already getting a bit cooler, and day lengths getting shorter and such like. So if it comes earlier next year in the spring of the year, and most likely way that would happen is in some pregnant cattle, and the birthing fluids and such like will then infect midges in the spring, then it's got a whole season to build up a head of steam during the hottest part of the year. So that's potentially why we worry that it could be worse. And the other thing is the people in the zones, it's done a really good job, but they have felt financial costs for that. So there's quite a big pushback from industry. It's protected those livestock dense areas, but feeling is that the zones might not be as rigorously imposed next year as this year, and it's partly because, as Fiona says, it's likely that there's going to be more widespread infection anyway. Next slide, please. So we've got the 3 vaccines. You know, whether to use them or not, really. And our thoughts are that it's often easier to vaccinate them in the winter, because you know the cattle tend to be close at hand. The hounds are not out on the hill. You haven't got to shed the lambs and ewes off, etc. If you're in the low vector period, you can't iatrogenically spread the vaccine, so there's probably less requirement for a new needle per animal. And if you're wanting to vaccinate several thousand sheep, you know, change a needle every time is going to be a very laborious thing. The vaccine isn't authorized for breeding males, but no vaccine ever is really, or very few. My feeling is those animals are the most valuable on the farm, and if they get blue tongue, you know, they're certainly not going to be very fertile. But like all vaccines, try and leave it 8 weeks from when they're vaccinated till they're actually going to go to work, to allow the spermatogenesis to recover. And for a lot of the sheep flocks, but also some of the breeding bulls, you know, they tend to be more at work in the summer and the autumn. So this winter's a good time, even if you're just going to vaccinate the males as the most expensive animals on your farm. Crack on, do the vaccine. The other thought is that the protection is 3 to 4 weeks, depending on which vaccine you use after your primary course. So for cattle, it's 2 doses. One of the sheep, the blue vac, the CVAC one, it's 2 doses, 3 weeks apart as well. So, you know, potentially you're looking at between 3 to 6 weeks after you've started vaccinating until you get protection. So if it starts to look like it's all going a bit Pete Tong and there's infection everywhere and sheep dying all over, you know, you've got quite a significant lag period before you can do too much about it. Next slide, please. So my feeling is, and Fiona's going to talk through the sort of the risk sort of table that's helped make the decisions, but probably comes down to the farmer's attitude to risk, and some will want to belt and braces and do as much as they can to reduce the chance of disease. And if they are going to want to do that, I think this winter period, while vaccine is available, and you know, it's got most of them, I think 2 of them have got authorized for a year's worth of protection, so it'll be the whole season protection. Crack on this winter and get it done. There are others, and they'll maybe just wait and see what the how it's going to pan out, because there are a lot of unknowns in this. But I think for those that want to sort of have that insurance, probably cracking on before calving and lambing is a good idea. Okay, that's me done. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate that. So next up is Laura Chesters, who's the on the BTVA board. She's going to speak to some of the more clinical aspects of the impacts of blue tongue. So over to you, Laura.
Hello, hope you can hear me okay. Yes, so echoing a lot of what Joe said, we're not really sure what's going to happen in next year, but what we can do is try and prepare for that. So a bit of a picture of what's been going on this year. We've had a variability in levels of morbidity in cattle. A lot have gone with no clinical signs and have been picked up on surveillance. So no clinical signs at all. Some have been quite sick with it. And the top 3 clinical signs we've seen in cattle have been malaise, lameness, and ulceration of the mouth, versus sheep, where this has more been like nasal discharge, malaise, and facial swelling as the top 3. We suspect the disease has been underreported, and this could be for a couple of reasons with cattle. Firstly, due to the limited and vague clinical signs, farmers not knowing that they've got the disease on the farm. And unfortunately, we believe there could be fear of restrictions from farmers, not wanting to report it, and therefore we're not sure what kind of clinical picture we've been looking at. on some of those cattle herds. Echoing what Joe said about vaccination, now could be a good time to vaccinate ahead of the spring. Mostly cattle are housed now that would be out in the summer when it might be more difficult, and we are in the vector low season. While we're still in the low bluetongue scenario we are in now, it could be safer to do that now rather than when we could end up in an outbreak. Another thing to note is that although cattle show less clinical signs, because they are bigger, they have a larger surface area, they have more chance of the midge biting, and therefore they are a bigger risk for spreading disease, so because they just have a bigger surface area for the midgie to bite. And then one more thing that we're worried about is this transplacental transmission. So this could be a risk for the spring in cattle that are currently carrying calves that have been infected and could give birth to infected calves in the spring, which will then give something for the midges to bite and spread onward disease from the spring onwards. And like Joe said, when that goes through the summer, our temperatures are getting warmer and we've got more likely to have bigger issues. So we're going to come on to a bit more about the vaccines, but there are some differences in the vaccine licences. There is a table of comparison that's on the Bluetongue Hub and will have been circulated to BCVA members, but it's up on the Bluetongue Hub if you want to look at that. Just to note is that one of the vaccines, Bultavo 3, the safety has not been established during lactation in that one, whereas it has in the other two. So sort of a risk-based approach based on that. As Gareth has pointed out, we're looking at a general licence now for England. It was general for those in restriction, specific for those out of restriction zones previously, but it's all now general licence in England, and Wales, Scotland and Ireland have not got authorisation for the vaccine yet, so we can't apply for licences there. Just some general things to note on vaccine use: that once it's been used, any leftovers must be returned to the practice of purchase, and the conditions on the general licence must be completed in the vaccine reporting form on the government website. So that's a farmer thing to do. And just going back to what Joe's point on the breeding males, obviously we've got bulls in cattle. Again, safety not established in those, but bluetongue is likely to cause pyrexia and therefore subsequent fertility issues. So that is a risk-based approach based on your thoughts. So yeah, I look forward to the Q&As a little bit later. That's all for me.
Thanks, Laura. A couple of additional comments. The first one, and this is me with disease surveillance hat on, to let you know that because there's crossover with other diseases in terms of what it might look like in terms of the risk of causing abortion, thinking here of things like Schmallenberg and general abortions as well, that APHA, as part of its abortion package, is doing testing to exclude for bluetongue. So I'd encourage, I mean, this should be done anyway, of course, for brucellosis purpose. So please, can you report abortions and get them investigated wherever possible? Secondly, there appears to be a bit of a discrepancy between the amount of vaccine that's reported as being used by farmers and what we're hearing from the manufacturers that is being prescribed by vets. So there is the ability to, and again, we would encourage you to do this, to report the prescription of vaccine. So that's also on the advice note that the CVO, Christine Middlemiss, released earlier in October. So, and if there's comments or questions about that, it would be good to hear those, because we want to sort of get a bit more understanding about why there's this gap between what we're hearing reported as used and what's being prescribed. So that's enough on that. Next up is probably the nub of what we're dealing with, which is a group of us have, led by Fiona, have looked at developing risk assessment tool for use of the vaccine. And so Fiona would like to present this to you and talk you through it. So over to you, Fiona.
Thanks, Gareth. So yes, this has been a BCVA, sheep vets, goat vets, camelids, an AHDB collaboration. This is not a perfect document, but we would really appreciate people putting input in. But we're going to release it on the Ruminant Health and Welfare group for people to use. So next slide, please. So it's basically a 3-sided document, and it's questions for vets to ask their clients to help your clients decide whether to vaccinate. So I'm sorry if that's a bit small for you, but basically red means more likely. If you have more answers in the red columns, you're more likely to vaccinate, and if you have more answers in the yellow, then probably less reason to vaccinate in that flock or herd. Arguably, we could have gone for yes vaccinate or no vaccinate, but reality is everybody is making quite a nuanced decision here, and there isn't a black and white, and people have different economic and all sorts of reasons, as I hope you'll understand as we kind of go through the document. So very simply, question 1, do you have cattle or sheep or camelids or other ruminants? And if yes, well, may vaccinate. If you don't have any of those animals, then clearly you don't need to vaccinate. It's as simple as that for the yes/no. Certainly, when they first released the vaccines in Europe, the farmers in the Netherlands were absolutely crying out for vaccine. They were so desperate because of the situation with BTV3 a year ago. And when the vaccines were first released in April, they were madly vaccinating lots and lots of sheep, because sheep is where you see the severe signs. Arguably, if you're trying to help contain the disease or prevent the spread, there's more logic potentially to vaccinate cattle, but people are making decisions of what they see in their flock or herd at the time, and it's sheep where they're seeing the big issues, which is why, you can understand why people want to vaccinate their sheep. If I had a flock of sheep, I would be vaccinating them. Then as we go down, what's the expected value? Obviously, if you have a high value or pedigree herd that each individual animal is worth a lot of money, whether it's a lamb, a calf, a kid, a cria, then more reason to vaccinate. Because if you get BTV3, particularly if you're a sheep flock, but it is all ruminants and camelids as well, there will be illness, and there will be deaths from ill animals. So if you're high value, more reason to vaccinate. The reason low value is not in the yellow, because you can never, that's everybody's individual decision. If their average value stock, you may well still really think it's a cost benefit to vaccinating, because you don't want to see your animals sick. And so that's why we haven't put lower value animals in the no, don't vaccinate, because it's an individual decision. So then we've got a bit on geography. So where are you in the UK? If you're down in that obvious area where most likely we'll first see bluetongue, because that's where it was, BTV3 was this year, those are likely to be the first counties that see it next year. Then there's more reason you need to get ahead of the curve. Arguably, we're expecting, I'm afraid, bluetongue 3 to be more widespread next year, and so arguably, even if you're not down in that southeast, you may well be thinking, actually, I want to vaccinate ahead of the curve. So but if you're right off really remotely, perhaps you'll have time. Once it kicks off, it could go quite quickly, but so that's what Joe was saying, there is vaccine available now, and it's potentially much easier to vaccinate in the winter than it is in springtime or through the summer. So that could influence your decisions for sure. And that's the same prevalence disease in your area. We're expecting it to be a bit more widespread next year, I'm afraid. Density of ruminants is important, but bear in mind it does not spread ruminant to ruminant, it spreads via midges. But if you have a lot of ruminants around you, there's more infected ruminants, there's more infected midges. So we know that a midge can travel up to 20 miles over land, and it can travel further over water. So that's why it does spread quite quickly. Once BTV3 is properly in the midge population, we don't have quite the same control as we would, for example, something that's just spread animal to animal, like foot and mouth, for example. Then question 6 is about whether you plan to, you may live up in the north west, but you plan to take animals to a show or buy in animals from down high risk. That puts you at higher risk. Any movement of animals, and that's why there's been movement restrictions in place, movements of animals will move disease and to infect your local midges. Once your local midges are infected, you're in less control. Next slide, please. So on the next page, we carry on down and talking about topography of your farm. Arguably, if there's only certain places on your farm where you can have ruminants and you're not able to get away from midges, then more reason to vaccinate. If you've honestly got good midge-proof protection of your buildings with good ventilation inside, or you've got really exposed windy ridges that are slightly less risk to midges, you may decide, actually, I'm okay, I don't want to vaccinate. So that's a consideration. How does a vaccination regime fit in with your handling and management is really key, and that is one of the main motivators, I think, for people wanting to vaccinate in the winter. So for stages of pregnancy, certainly for sheep flocks, I would prefer to vaccinate my ewes in mid-pregnancy than either than at the point of lambs or when they've just got lambs at foot or whatever. Practically, winter you've got your cattle housed, they're close in. There may be really good practical reasons why you might want to do it now. Amy, you had a very specific thing about camelids and timings, and I don't know if you want to add that in now. Sorry. Or
no, that's absolutely fine. I can completely appreciate that not every farm practitioner has camelids on the books. So the timing, say, of the unpacking season is way different to what we would have for lambing or block calving, for example. So it's just worth pointing out that this unpacking season happens over summer. So therefore, the middle trimester, which is arguably, the time where it's a little safer to handle and organise your pregnant females, would be around now, because they would be getting pregnant towards May time, because they unpack and then a few weeks later they are remated. They're pregnant for an awfully long time. So just in terms of vaccine management, if you had clients that were umming and ahhing as to whether to do it now or in spring, arguably now is a safer time than spring would be, because it is so close to unpacking and also revaccination time for Clostridial disease.
Brilliant. Thanks, Amy. I knew that was the time to get you in there. So then we've got a bit of a section on considering the stage of pregnancy and breeding males. And this is a load of debate goes on here, but and you don't want to be vaccinating at the point that you've just put your rams or your bulls in, purely because you're wanting embryos to implant. You want them to be at least stressed. There's plenty of reasons why we don't want to stress animals at the point of breeding. So that's why we're saying mid-pregnancy is a good time. Either not pregnant or mid-pregnancy would be a good time. In terms of breeding males, and we've mentioned it before, and it's a classic because we don't have the data in breeding males, and so there's a kind of conspiracy theory thing and everyone's terrified about it. Quite honestly, males, as Joe said, are really valuable animals. So the way we've done it here, if you've only got a few breeding males and you really need them to work, then it really matters if your only males on the farm get bluetongue. Arguably, they're high priority to vaccinate and protect them as far as possible. If you've got absolutely loads of males on the farm, and even if a few get ill, you've got others you can use to breed with your females, well, potentially that's you a bit further over into the yellow side of the decision tree. The stage of breeding, so we would say don't do anything stressful at the point of turning them out, and vaccination is one of those things. So yes, if you can leave them 2 months side of breeding, great. Quite honestly, all the data about vaccines, especially the BTV 8, where we have a lot more data, but is the same sort of principles as the BTV 3 in terms of the vaccine. There is the data on the problems with breeding males it's not there. Whereas the problems with the virus getting into breeding males, that's massive. We definitely know if you get active BTV3 infection, you will not have fertile males. So from that point of view, if you're umming and ahhing and you're scared about vaccinating, I would be a lot more scared about the disease than I would be about the vaccine. So it's just worth trying to put it in context. One really important thing, if you've got clients who are exporting, what we don't know is the potential ongoing impacts of having seropositive animals. So that's an important consideration. It's down number 12 on our list. If you don't ever intend selling animals or germplasm for export, no problem at all vaccinating. If you're an exporting farm, then potentially we know with some of the BTV8 vaccines that the animals can remain seropositive for, I think it's seven years, so and potentially we don't know whether that might in the future have an effect. In a situation, I personally would much prefer to have a vaccinated animal than the chance of them being ill, but it is worth considering that if you've got a client who definitely wants to export, you want to at least mention that. Next slide, please. We're nearly through this now. Next slide, please. The final questions is literally about weather conditions. So currently, we're going into a period where we know that the virus doesn't replicate in the midge below 12 degrees. So there is a lag period where midges are still infective. That's why we're not yet at low vector period, because we still have infected midges. But as we've gone further through that, then we'll get to a stage a bit further on in the winter where we don't have infected midges. What we most don't want for next year is a really hot spring and summer, because that's the worst situation for blue tongue being quite prevalent. So we've tried to put all this information into this slightly complicated document. Though the wording at the end is about biosecurity, it's about reminding people that BTV3 is spread by midges, so everybody's at risk. It's trying to remind people that concurrent disease in your flock and herd means that you're less able to mount immune response to a vaccination. But obviously considerations. There's a big thing in the licensing about you have to use a new needle for every animal. Quite honestly, in some large sheep flocks, that's just not practical. There's a big difference if you're vaccinating in a low risk time, then the risk of sharing needles is exactly the same for BTV3 vaccines as it is for any other vaccine. If you're used to sharing needles and you've got a protocol to minimize the risks, there's no difference. If you're vaccinating in the face of active BTV3 in your area, then bear in mind you may have animals who have been infected who are not yet showing clinical signs, and by sharing a needle you are then spreading BTV3 through your flock or herd. So that's a very good reason not to share needles if you're in a high risk period, and that's another good reason to be vaccinating in the winter and not waiting until the summer. On the rest of the document, we've got some hyperlinks that go to the vaccine comparison sheet that we made before and the ruminant health and welfare information to vets. So next slide, please, Anna. I've just taken some screenshots here from the ruminant health and welfare document. Now, if you can easily get to the ruminant health and welfare page, and there is a blue tongue hub. It's a bit harder to get to the you see at the very top of that slide, blue tongue virus information for vets. That is where you want to be as a vet, and that is where you can access all these documents. So a few vets have been confused and not been able to get to the vet information, because if you just Google it, you get through to the farmer hub. So that's really important to put that bluetongue virus information for vets in to get yourself to the right page. So it tells you about the general license of bluetongue virus. It gives you this vaccine comparison guidelines that a group of us put together when the vaccines first became available. So it will compare. It's basically taken the SPCs for the sheet for Bultavo and Bluvac and Sevavil and compared them against each other for an easy sort of ready reckoner for vets. And because obviously the 2 doses for sheep or the vaccines are different and there's different decisions to make, and that just summarizes that the information is freely is available via the companies, whatever. That just puts it all out on compares with each other. Those are freely available for vets, and with thanks to each of the veterinary associations who've inputted into that. I just also put a screenshot there of the in practice article. If the worst case happens and we have a lot of infected BTV3 infected sheep, then as vets, just draw on the experiences of the guys in the Netherlands. It was such a sudden thing for them, and they had a lot of panic, and they had a lot of farmers going into chemists and buying medicines and trying things out. And we've tried to pull together the data from the literature on considerations. Just Google that and find it through in practice. It's open access for anyone to access. So Gareth, I think that's all I needed to say. All of these resources will be available. Ruminant health and welfare, bluetongue virus information for vets, and people can access them through that.
Great, thanks, Fiona. So if I could invite the other participants to put their cameras on. We're getting got a few questions. So we'll wing this bit. So we'll answer the questions according to So the first thing is on the probably for Fiona, but we can all chip in, I guess. Is on the question 5 in your slides, Fiona, on the risk assessment, which is about the distance of midge flight. And the questioner has questioned the distance of 1 to 5 kilometers of 20 miles, 32 kilometers, and they're pointing out that most midge flights are short over land, but longer over water. So it was really just to ask about the justification for that sort of distance, really.
Yeah, and that's and I am not a midge expert.
Good start, isn't
it? To be fair, when we first put that in, I think I had a question mark, what's the figure here? And to be perfectly honest, somebody else put that in, and I'm not exactly sure who. So per Bright, and there is a lot of information about midge, but they can fly up to 20 miles, I am assured, but I don't have the exact reference. I'm sorry, I'm told.
I think it also depends on the wind speed massively. If it's
fair point. Yes, yeah, that's not a midge like under its own steam necessarily, but a good gust of wind going along. Yeah.
There's a few questions that are coming about about MDA. So do we know anything about whether lambs are protected for when ewes are vaccinated, or calves and cows?
My understanding, and I'm pretty, and this would be something to ask the manufacturers of the vaccine, because there is in the sheet on for what they have to say, then there's not a huge amount of information, although MDA is mentioned. I personally wouldn't bank on having too much vaccinating the dams and then relying it for too long in the offspring, purely because we haven't had long enough to have lots of data in. I'm prepared for somebody else to correct me on that, but these vaccines very first were used in Europe in April. So for BTV3, Yeah. So, but I
Yeah.
would wait a couple of months, 3 months. I think one of them said it has to be 3 months before you vaccinate young stock.
Yeah, and again, I think that's precautionary. It's one of these things. It's going to be a rapidly changing situation. We don't have a huge amount of information at this sort of stage, so I think as we get more information, we'll we can pass that. Someone's commented that they were told by Boehringer 3 to 5 months. Again, I
Okay,
suspect
that's helpful.
that's
Thank you.
yeah. And again, I think that's probably sort of precautionary rather than anything. One question which I shall attempt to answer here, which is about someone's had a question from a farmer. I think I hope this isn't just like a question from a friend, but it's how long after vaccination do animals remain PCR positive? So how soon could they be pre-movement tested? Well, the answer to that is the vaccines are killed, so they shouldn't stimulate a PCR response. Though I think there is again a short precautionary period after vaccination. I can't remember exactly what it is, just to obviate that. But being a killed vaccine, it shouldn't affect the PCR. Any other comments on that one?
Yeah, on the government website, yeah, it's a week after vaccination, then you can commence pre-movement testing, but it's got to be 7 days.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Mandy said the same.
There's a previous question, Gareth. It's on the I found it on my comparison now on the Bultavo 3 MDA. Maternally derived antibodies disappear within 3 months of age in lambs and within 2.5 months of age in cattle, is what it says on their data.
Great, thank you. Yeah, but again, that information is likely to change as time goes on.
And to be fair, for the other two, for the blueback and the silver bull, they'll talk about MDA, but not necessarily on they don't necessarily have information available. But they're getting more information through all the time, so it's always worth talking to the companies.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Next one. There's a worry about transplacental infection in cattle, which Laura's already mentioned. Is this the case for sheep as well? And what about? While we're answering that, we could ask about camelids. Do we know anything about those?
As far as I understand, the situation with the sheep in Europe, that so many of the sheep that were clinically infected, the mortality rates was so high that actually that was like kind of trumped everything else in a way. So I think there's no reason why that isn't the case, but the risk for cattle is because they're so much more likely to be subclinically infected that you won't necessarily have known that you had BTV3 and then a calf is born down the line, but you wouldn't necessarily know about it. So if that makes sense. Do you know with Amy, do you know with camelids?
The answer is much the same. Because we haven't had any confirmed cases in camelids in the UK, like our gene pool for knowledge is really, really low. And the animals that have died on the continent are dead. So we, again, we're not really aware of like subclinical levels there. But again, I don't see any reason that if we're concerned about it in cattle, why we wouldn't be concerned about it in the other species. So it is something that we are going to have to emphasize to owners that they must be vigilant for. And because there's no legal requirement really for reporting abortion or strange congenital defects, it is going to rely on, you guys as veterinary surgeons to go out there and say, look, if something is weird, we want to know about it.
Yeah, thanks. Next one is, are there any data on duration of immunity? Shall I answer that one? The answer at the moment is that's very much a work in progress. It's one of the big drivers for enabling trade. It's one of the key pieces of information that we need. So the manufacturers will be developing the data as we speak. There is some data, but it's not in public domain at the moment. So I'm afraid I can't answer that any more specifically than that. But again, watch this space. Right, more question. Sorry, here's a good one. A difficult one to answer, but what do we think Wales and Scotland would do if England was all put into an RZ? How would this affect cross-border movements? Anyone want to hit that one?
Quite honestly, if the whole of England is put into an RZ because of levels of infection, the midges don't recognise a border. So especially going west. Going north, it's slightly, looking at Schmallenberg data, there is a northern boundary, it's the same midges. So we may be, we know it's quite feasible for Scottish midges to transmit, but we don't have Schmallenberg cases in Scotland. There is a bit that we don't know about. Scotland's known for its midges mind. So yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think so. I think, to add to that, I think that the likelihood is that in terms of vaccination, at the moment, what's happening is that you can't move animals from the RZ to Wales, or any of the other devolved. You can move animals into the free area and then on, and the same is true for animals that have been vaccinated. Obviously with appropriate pre and post movement testing. That won't be the case if a whole of England's an RZ. So that will change the game, and that will probably be a big driver for allowing vaccination. But as I say, this is us second guessing. We're not the policy makers. That's up to the individual countries and their devolved administrations. Right. Yeah, as someone's pointed out, we've had Schmallenberg cases in Dumfries in August, September. But and there have been cases I know up in further north, but the prevalence would appear to be quite a lot lower than it has been in other parts of GB. Right, here's another question. If transplacental transmission is the most likely mode of virus overwintering, were the signs of this occurring in the Netherlands? Didn't BTV 320 emerge in Germany? Anybody want to pick up on that one?
I think
it was on next to the German border, wasn't it, when they first started finding it this spring? But since then, it's a lot in Belgium and Western Holland and stuff. So yeah, I don't think it's just been that.
Starting again in the Netherlands was close to Germany, but it's basically gone ballistic right through those countries. The numbers of cases have been huge. I don't know whether that's all through placental.
Yeah. I mean, it's not the only method of overwintering. Remember, there's survival of midges, adult midges. We're pretty sure at the moment that there isn't transovarial spread. So, but that's not clear yet with BTV3. It was certainly the case in with BTV8. So there's a lot of unknowns with that. So there are other overwintering mechanisms that are likely to have taken place, and the most common one is likely to be survival of infected midges over the winter. Because remember, with microclimates and what have you, and the lower temperatures, midges can survive a lot longer. So that's the most likely route. With transplacental probably secondary to that, but again, we just don't know. I'm very conscious there's just a minute left, so we'll keep going. When do you think we'll get a fully authorised vaccine?
I don't think I don't think any. I don't know whether. Yeah. Maybe that's something that, unless you're party to the licenses that people have put in, I don't know the answer to that, Gareth.
I think it's fair to say that that's another evolving situation. Manufacturers will be producing the information as we speak. So, I think they'll be working towards marketing authorization because that gives a commercial advantage as well. Question here about is there a risk that vaccinating early in winter will lead to waning immunity in summer and autumn? And to be honest, I think that's a very, very fair question. And particularly at the moment, we don't know what the duration of immunity is because there's nothing stated. So until we know that information, that is a really pertinent question. And again, that will sort of sit within the risk assessment. And what I suggest we will probably do, speaking on behalf of the group of us here, is we'll be revisiting the risk assessment as more information becomes available. So once we get an understanding of what the duration of immunity is, it 6 months, is it a year? We don't know. That will inform that process. So I suggest we'll make that iterative to a degree if people are in agreement with that. But yeah, thanks for the question. It's a good one.
I think the Sylvia Vac suggested a year before revaccination.
Yeah. Just a point here. Our time is up now, but if people are happy to hang on for a couple of minutes, we can answer some of these. Keep on going. Are you happy to do that, team? Yeah. One point here that I've been asked to remind you to for you to remind your clients to when you're submitting the general license to ensure that the data is uploaded to gov.uk. There's a specific form to do that. Also, as I said earlier, for vets to report their prescription of vaccine, so we can get a better understanding of its use and where it's going. One of the things about the RZ, and this is part of the reason for the impact study, there's also an APHA impact study, which is looking specifically at the impact on individual farms within the RZ that have had clinical disease. We don't have much of an understanding of how widespread disease is on affected farms once they've had disease. Once it's been identified, there isn't a great. The pressure is to see how far disease has spread. Therefore, we've got less understanding of what's happening locally within the RZ about what the on-farm prevalence is. That's very relevant now for the development of disease through overwintering next year, and that goes back to what Joe was saying about the earlier start. It also means how much is going to be there, and that's actually highly relevant, obviously, in terms of deciding whether you vaccinate or not. Amy, I think you wanted to say something. Did you want to come in now?
Yeah, go on then. I wanted to highlight that I have been in the restricted zone pretty much since it kicked off. I'm working in Essex, so from a sort of person on the ground perspective, I can completely sympathise with a lot of you who might be feeling like the farmers are really fatigued with messaging around bluetongue, like it's gone on for long enough, or it hasn't necessarily been as severe as it was on the continent, therefore it's not a problem. And I do sympathise with you having to have discussions with farmers when some of the answers to questions that we all have are, I don't know yet. So I just wanted to highlight that I don't want you to walk away from a webinar or a bunch of information that's been thrown at you this evening thinking that there isn't discussion going on and that we don't know anything. It has really, really helped me having discussions with farmers for what feels like 100 years now about bluetongue to utilise the resources on the Ruminant Health and Welfare website. And also, we do want to hear from you as to what the vibe is on the ground, like how you are feeling about the management of bluetongue in general. It's only when we have sort of consensus and opinions from everyone that we can actually actively represent your views and the views of your clients, in these group discussions that we do have regularly. So basically, to summarise, I sympathise that it can be a bit tiring to not know things, but this is the nature of emerging disease, and your influence will affect how we maybe manage this in future, but we have to be informed to know that. And it's also worth pointing out, because I do hear some farmers unfortunately saying to me that they don't want to report the clinical signs. One of the reasons why it is so important to do so is because it looks like other things that are potentially much more damaging to our agricultural landscape, like foot and mouth. Now, I don't like to use the FMD words, but really it's a legitimate reason to be reporting these clinical signs. So please try to get on board with re-emphasising the importance of reporting and the fact that we are a team trying to work through this together.
I would just back up what Amy just said, so thank you for that. I'm conscious that time is now getting on, and we probably need to sort of move on. Let's just have a look and see if there's any more last questions. There's one comment here about a client reporting suspect disease in the RZ, and AFA said they did not have the means, people power to perform testing. Can OVs in practice not be used to perform some of this testing to help us gauge an understanding of the spread of restriction zone, and also testing herds with diagnosed disease? I think one of the fair point. One of the issues here is resource. We're coming into winter now, and we're going to get overlap with AI, the avian influenza AI, and resource has to be carefully managed. It does become tricky in terms of using OVs. There's certainly some ability to do that. I think there's also, just to explain that for testing within the RZ, there's what's called a light procedure, which enables testing to be done, but it's done in a less time limited way, so it takes longer to do. So those are being looked into, but it will take longer to report those results back. That's probably as much as I can say on that. I am conscious that we've run out of time, so I think we'll make a stop there. I'm just trying to think, what sort of route can we have for questions to sort of continue to come in? I don't know whether Mandy can comment on that from an ongoing perspective, if people do have further questions, rather than it just sort of stopping now.
Yeah, so you can send in questions to AHDB. You can pop them in the chat here if you've got anything further. We can take those on board, or you can get in touch with us through or Ruminant Health and Welfare. You can get in touch through that website as well. Great. And obviously your societies, BCVA, Sheep Veterinary Society and the Camelid Society, will put us through. And Anna's put in an email address, which is ke.events@ahdb.org.uk. Or to me personally. Yeah, that's fine. Great. Thanks, Gareth.
Great, thanks, Mandy. So I think we'll wrap up there. It's just to say thank you to you firstly for attending and for the great questions that we've had. I'd like to thank Fiona, Joe, Laura, and Amy for your input. I'd also like to thank AHDB for hosting this. And that's been, it's been a really, really useful series of webinars that we've had over the past few months, and this is just another one. Excuse me. I just say, watch this space in terms of the vaccine information. It's a very changing world, and it's going to change quite rapidly. So, thank you again for your time.